Hello. So I'm doing things a little bit differently still because I'm still recovering from, or trying to recover from a sprained knee. So I'm going to do this from my desk instead of over in front of the altar. So apologize for that, but we'll do this together anyway. So if you're watching this on Sunday morning, then the reason I'm not at White Sands today is that I'm at Stetson University and we have commencement ceremonies all day. So I'm there doing invocations and benedictions on crutches or with a cane or however it happens to work out. So I'd like to start today with a meditation. If you're driving and listening to this, don't do this. Just kind of listen or skip over. Um, but otherwise, just take a few breaths, easy and natural, and let your body relax. You can close your eyes if you'd like, or just rest your gaze softly in front of you somewhere. And let the breaths come and go, letting the body settle without trying to force anything or do anything special. And then notice any sensations in your body. In particular, be aware of any tension or pain that you've been fighting. Don't try to change it, just be attentive to it. At the same time, see if you can drop any of the barriers that you have been erecting to protect yourself from these feelings. And do the same with any tension in your mind. If there are thoughts or feelings that you've been struggling with, anything that you're fighting or denying, just let it go. Don't worry about letting go of the thoughts or feelings. Let go of the resistance. Let your heart open up to whatever is going on. Just breathe and let it be. Be aware of the struggles in your life. Sense any conflicts inside yourself. Do you struggle with your body, your feelings, loneliness, fear, anger, grief, craving? How have you defended yourself against these feelings, against pain or fear? Have you created a barrier to protect yourself that has instead become an obstacle to understanding your true nature? See if you can just soften your heart toward whatever is present. See if you can stop clinging. Just be with whatever is there. Let yourself fall free from any self-imposed constraints. So as we leave meditation, try to keep this relaxed spaciousness, this peacefulness with you. So I want to talk a little bit about mindfulness. You've probably heard the story about the group of blind monks and the elephant. Each of these old monks examines a different part of the elephant. One touches a tusk and says, an elephant is like a plowshare. One grabs a hold of its leg and says, it's a pillar. Another touches its ear and says, no, it's like a winnowing basket, and so on. Each of them is in contact with a different part and sees that, and none of them really understands the whole. I'm reminded of this story whenever somebody asks me to talk about mindfulness. In Buddhism, that concept, mindfulness, is woven throughout the teachings, and it has different applications in different contexts. So it's a method of meditation, for example, or at least it's actually a system of meditation with a number of different methods. It's also a way of working with your attention in daily life. And it's the sort of largest area. It's kind of the glue that connects all the other factors of the Eightfold Path to one another. So 30 or 40 years ago, mindfulness practice, as it's derived from Buddhism, started appearing in various secular settings like mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a clinical application of it, to pain management. And it's been studied and recommended in various fields of psychology. It's showing up in corporate programs to help employees handle stress and become more empathetic and better managers and all that kind of stuff. So, in this sort of secularized cultural view of mindfulness, we've ended up with something kind of like these blind men trying to describe the elephant. What is it? It depends on what part of it you're happen to be grasping onto. But the Buddha didn't teach mindfulness as a coping mechanism or as a way to make better employees or whatever. It's a path to spiritual liberation, part of a path to spiritual liberation, to transcending the pain of human life. He fully explained mindfulness practice in a discourse called the Satipatthana Sutta. Mindfulness is the usual translation of a Pali word sati, and in contemporary Western usage, it's usually described as sort of a non reactive, non judgmental awareness. And that's part of it, but sati in a broader sense has kind of a quality of remembering. So satipatthana is a compound word that's translated as foundations of mindfulness or establishings of mindfulness or sort of frames of reference, depending on how you break it down. I look at it as a blueprint for living mindfully. These four foundations or establishings of mindfulness are kind of like four legs of a chair. Together, they create a strong support for a spiritual practice. The Buddha starts that particular discourse by summarizing the teaching. He says, "Herein a monk lives contemplating the body in the body, ardent, alert, and aware, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world." And then he goes on in the same way, contemplating feelings and feelings, consciousness and consciousness, mental objects and mental objects, ardent, alert, and aware, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. So, if we approach mindfulness as a spiritual practice, we have these four elements: mindfulness of the body, feelings, consciousness, and mental objects. And we're looking to see them in and of themselves. So, these are objects of meditation, but we don't practice meditation in order to be meditators. We meditate in order to achieve something spiritually. So, these are also reference points for mindfulness in life, in daily life, in our spiritual life. The Buddha says to be ardent, alert, and aware with regard to each of these things. So, this is a key to practicing mindfulness: ardent, alert, and aware. Ardent refers to diligence, staying committed. Alert means keeping the mind on what is happening in the present. And aware in this case means to keep what you are doing in mind, keeping your attention on the process. So I was talking about this one time during a service or a retreat or whatever. It came up in a Dharma talk, and it happened to be Bike Week. And on my way to the temple that day, I'd seen a lot of motorcycles on the road. And it occurred to me that this practice of mindfulness is kind of like riding a motorcycle. So when people come down here to Daytona Beach for Bike Week, they like to ride these scenic routes through the countryside. They'll go along the beach, visit historic towns, things like that. And a lot of them like to ride this thing called the Ormond Loop, which is a scenic drive up the coast and back. So if you were down for Bike Week and wanted to do that, it would be helpful if you were ardent, alert, and aware. You have to bring some energy and effort to what you're doing. You can't just stay in your hotel room thinking about how nice it would be to go for a ride. You have to actually get up out of bed, get on your bike, start down the road. And you have to stay on your bike. You have to make an effort to keep riding. And then once you're on the road, you want to clearly comprehend what's going on. You don't want to be muddy-headed on a bike, right, on a motorcycle. You want to be able to see where you're going, be alert to dangers, respond to what arises in a skillful way so that you don't crash and things like that. And then you have to keep in mind where you want to go. You want to go up the highway along the beach, cross over the river, come back through the state parks. You remember what the route is, and you stay on the route, and you watch to make sure that you don't get distracted or get lost. And so a big part of mindfulness practice is to stay with what's really there. We were just discussing a part of the Dhammapada the other night in our Thursday Zoom meeting. There's one verse where the backstory is about the importance of that. So it's verse 101. And the verse reads, "Better than 1,000 useless verses is one useful verse, hearing which one attains peace." So the origin of that, these are the Dhammapada are short sayings that the Buddha gave. And then there's these kind of backstories that you can find where they came from. And so the origin of this particular one referred to an ascetic who he wasn't practicing Buddhism yet. This was about his encounter with the Buddha, but he had been practicing as an ascetic, and he was very, very near enlightenment. And he really just needed a little nudge in the right direction from the Buddha, which the Buddha recognized. And so he encountered this ascetic while on an alms round, and he stopped in the middle of the alms round to give him this teaching. Standing there in the middle of the road, the Buddha told him this. He said, "When you see an object, be conscious of just the visible object. When you hear a sound, be conscious of just the sound. When you smell or taste or touch something, be conscious of just the smell, the taste, or the touch. And when you think of anything, be conscious of just the mind object." In hearing just this short, simple instruction, this man was enlightened. And so he ordained under the Buddha and ordained as already a completely liberated arhat. So mindfulness includes paying attention to what's going on here and now and limiting it to that. So if you're on the motorcycle, you don't want to think about how nice and soft your bed was back in the hotel or relive some rude thing that someone said last night. You pay attention to your surroundings so that you don't miss the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees as you go through the state park, or the dolphins playing in the surf as you go along the beach. The Buddha also talks about contemplating these objects, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. So what does this mean? It means if you encounter an obstacle, you deal with it skillfully. You might have to stop for a traffic light, but that doesn't mean you get mad and give up, turn around. You might see a bar over by the roadside surrounded by bikes or think maybe there's a good party going on there, but you stay on your path. You're not waylaid by things that come into your awareness. You put aside attachment and aversion with reference to those things. Let things pass or otherwise do what you need to do without engaging with them in a way that creates stress. So if a thought arises while you're meditating, you don't have to get hung up on it. Cling to it, add to the story, all those kind of things. If you feel something unpleasant, you don't have to reject it. You just let things go or let things be. And that doesn't mean that you put up with injustices and things like that. It just means that you stay in your seat. You do the steering. You don't let yourself be pulled off the path. So when you put this to work, developing your knowledge of the body, feelings, consciousness, mental objects, and so on, you develop a deeper insight into their nature. So let's look at this word contemplation, which is how we practice mindfulness. When we talk about contemplating something in casual use, if I said, I'm contemplating what I'm going to do later today, that generally means that we're thinking about it. It means having an internal dialogue about where I want to go for lunch or whatever. But in this context, contemplation refers to this entire process that's needed for knowing something in a complete and realistic way. That might include thinking about it, but that's only one facet of knowing. To contemplate the body, for example, you start by intimately knowing your breath. You focus on your breath first to the exclusion of everything else. And then as you become calmer and see your experience more clearly, the breath actually begins to include all other experience. So you feel the rise and fall of the breath, and you know everything else in your body and the bodies of all other beings comes and goes just like the breath. You don't need to think about that stuff anymore while you're meditating because you're experiencing it directly. You experience the breath, which is happening in this body and in your consciousness, and you experience whatever else arises and comes into your consciousness as part of that without any need to evaluate it or think about it or judge it or decide it's good or bad or whatever. While you're meditating on your breath, you might notice that something comes into your awareness and starts to affect a change in your state of mind. So you notice the mental object of an angry thought, for instance. If you cling to that mental object, your consciousness now contains anger. But maybe you've achieved a more refined mental state of concentration. So now you can let go of an angry thought and maintain that more refined mental state. You just let the mental object arise and pass away without letting it change your awareness. So, one of the skills that we're practicing here is the ability to distinguish between what arises in our minds, in our bodies, in our environment, and our awareness of it, which is our consciousness. So, you might think of consciousness as something like a lake. If you ever look at a map of Florida, you'll see the St. Johns River. It's a long river that runs through a number of lakes, starts down in like southeast of Orlando, and then goes up through the state to Jacksonville and into the Atlantic Ocean. And all kinds of things come down the river and pass through those lakes, just like all kinds of things come into and pass through our consciousness. If you're an environmental scientist trying to improve the water quality in one of the lakes, well, some things you just let travel on through. You'd make an effort to remove pollutants that would harm the living beings in there. And you'd try to make some areas especially suitable to support the kind of fish and other wildlife that would be healthiest for that environment. So think about your consciousness like that lake. Mental objects flow through. They're not separate from it. Skillful mental objects like concentration and tranquility are dependent on your consciousness to exist. And so are unskillful mental objects like anger and restlessness. So the more aware you are of the health of your consciousness, the quicker you can remove the pollutants from your mental environment, the more you can make it a suitable place for skillful mental qualities like compassion and loving kindness to reside. So going back to the earlier question, what is mindfulness? I think we could say it's a method of developing the skillful use of attention in order to create a healthy spiritual environment that will allow our lives, spiritual and day-to-day lives, to flourish. I mentioned earlier the story of the group of blind monks trying to describe an elephant. So there's a less well-known story about a group of blind elephants who encountered a monk for the first time. The first elephant examined the monk by sitting on him, and he announced that monks were flat. Well, the rest of the group examined the monk, and they also agreed that monks were indeed flat. Well, I hope that you will work with mindfulness practice. Grab it wherever you can, make use of it however you can. But remember, it's not one-dimensional, and so don't try to flatten it out too much. Anyway, hopefully you can keep letting your experience of mindfulness grow and enhance your relationship to both your inner world and your outer world. So thank you very much for your attention today. Hope you have a great Sunday, and I will see you again soon.